It's the Middlesized Garden Late Summer Garden Tips and Tour, and it's Alexandra here. And we'll be covering a new, well, vintage pergola, which we put up in the centre of the part of the garden we call the parterre, which is changing the focal point. So we'll talk a bit about installing a pergola and also focal points. And the border I revamped last autumn has finally got to somewhere close to where I would like it to be. And there have been some quite interesting lessons along the way. The Middlesized Garden is a walled town garden in southeast England, and it's about 100 foot long and about 80 foot wide, but it's L-shaped, so it's 40 foot wide nearer the door. We have quite mild winters. It's rare for us to go below -6 Celsius 21 Fahrenheit, which in theory would equate us to a USDA zone of about 9. But of course our summers are nowhere near as warm as a 9 would be. The average is 22, 23 degrees Celsius, and that's pretty much what this summer has been like. And there's also been a reasonable amount of rain. It hasn't been one of these hot, dry summers. So gardens are just beginning to look good. We did have a difficult and cold, dry spring, and that held plants back quite a lot. When you come out of the back door, you go up some steps into an area we call the parterre. So this area has had a selection of different things in the middle of it, and they're very much a focal point. I started off with a pot of nepeta. I then got a topiary spiral, which I love, and then we changed it to a sundial. But when we first changed the garden, an artist friend of ours said that he thought we needed something high in the middle of the parterre. And with his artist's eye, we thought he was probably right. And we did research it, but it was very difficult to find something we liked and we could afford. However, 8 years later, a friend of ours had this pergola in her garage, and it's a vintage one, it's second-hand, it's very pretty. She renovated it for us and we bought it. If you're buying a large piece of equipment for the garden and it's vintage, you may not have the instructions of how to put it together. We were very lucky because she and her partner had actually put numbers on all the different parts. So on the whole, we could see how to put it together, but it had to be disassembled from her yard and then brought up to our garden, brought in pieces and then reassembled. And that takes time, and it's also not a one-person job. So it's worth bearing that in mind. The other thing is that if you're going to have a pergola in your garden, you need a really firm, strong, flat surface to put it on, because if it's an uneven surface, that will place strains on the structure. We were lucky, we've actually got stone here in the middle, so that wasn't a problem. However, if you had decking, you would have to check that the decking could take the extra weight. If you're going to put something like this on grass, then you would sink pillars into the ground as supports, and you would actually then be able to secure it with that. But you would need to check that you weren't going to go into any drains or any electrical cables. We've actually just positioned this here temporarily. When we actually decide it's in exactly the right position, we will actually secure it to the ground with bolts, but that will mean drilling into the stone. So we don't want to do that until we know that it's in exactly the right position. There is a bit of a complication with this because it hasn't got 4 legs, it's got 5. And that means that we no longer have a view from the back door all the way along and then straight out into the garden. I discussed this with garden designer Posy Gentles, and she said that of course when we had either the topiary spiral or the nepeta or the sundial, you could look at those and then look beyond. With this, you actually look at this pergola as a focal point, and what this does is it makes this garden a much more enclosed area, even though you can still see the lawn behind. We might actually even add to this sense of enclosure by putting in some borders along the wall, but that's something we're still thinking about. What we most want to do is not to have it feeling as if it had been sort of dropped from above and it didn't really belong. We're not going to put climbers up this pergola because it's very pretty. I don't think it needs them. I don't think it'll add anything. But also we'll either have to add pots, which would add a bit more clutter to the area, or we would have to drill holes in the stone. And we don't want to do that. But we do want it to feel as if it's surrounded by planting and it really belongs here. The Re-vamp border is now looking much fuller and much more full of flowers than it has been, although it's not exactly as I envisaged it. I think unless you are a very experienced and talented garden designer, it's probably very difficult to make a border that looks exactly the way it might in your mind. But there are things I like about it. Last October, I almost completely cleared this border. Plants had got very old, some had spread too much, and it was getting increasingly difficult just to take out a few old dead plants and then put in others, because some plants were really absolutely swamping the border and choking others. So I thought it was absolutely time to start again, and a rather lovely challenge to have. Garden designer friends advised me that actually I would get the best results if I cleared as many plants as possible, because it's difficult to revamp a border if you're working around a lot of the old stuff that's still in there. And so I left in some shrubs and I left in the roses. And then I planted. There's a lot of thought at the moment that planting in autumn works really well because the ground is warm and the plants get time to get a bit established. Then winter comes, they go dormant, and then when spring arrives, they're just really all set to start growing. And that theory is really good, but sadly it wasn't good for last autumn. I did plant some perennials in last autumn, and what happened was that we had an exceptionally wet autumn, followed by an exceptionally early freeze. And so these newly planted plants were sitting in cold, wet soil, or even cold, frozen soil, both of which all plants hate. And they weren't properly dormant, so I did lose quite a few of them. When you're planting a border, perennials are plants that actually stay in your garden for 3 years or more. And of course that means you buy them once, they grow, quite often they'll spread, and so they are economical and they're less work because you're not putting them in spring and then taking them out in autumn. A lot of head gardeners and garden designers suggest that, say, 80% perennials and 20% annuals is about right for a border. An annual is a plant that grows from seed at the beginning of the year, flowers, sets seeds, dies, and is then taken away by the end of the year. However, perennials take a little bit of time to get established, and I was buying cheaper 9cm pots. Perennials need to be planted a certain distance apart because they need space to grow. Plant expert Rosy Hardy of Rosy Hardy Gardening YouTube channel told me that although bigger perennials obviously need more space and smaller perennials can manage with less space, if you want a rough rule of thumb for planting any perennials, you should take a plant in each hand and then plant them about shoulder width apart. So that's what I did, but of course if you've got small 9cm pots, you've got quite a bit of a gap between them. Now what you do with that is that you fill it with annuals because they compete in a different way to the perennials. The perennials can carry on growing, the annuals grow, you take the annuals out, the perennials continue to carry on growing. And a friend gave me some Nicotiana seedlings and also some cosmos seedlings. So I have a patch of cosmos and a patch of Nicotiana. And as well as filling gaps, I also think that these provide a sort of brightness. And I think that when I'm buying plants next spring or this autumn, I should think about some of the brighter colours, because the plants I've chosen have a sort of slightly bruised palette, which is lovely, but just a little bit of brightness does help. There are a few bits that I particularly like. For example, this sedum, or it's now known as Hylotelephium, as it's been reclassified by the botanists. It's Matrona, and do you know, I bought it 12 years ago and I planted it in the wrong place, in such a dark little corner of the border that I even forgot it was there, and it barely existed. But when I was clearing the border, I came across a few little strands of it and I thought, my goodness, this plant is still here. So I planted it here in the front, in the sun, in the right spot, and look how well it's done from a tiny neglected scrap. So if your plants are not doing well where they are, it really is worth moving them. However, don't move them in summer, move them in spring or autumn. That's because summer, even if you have quite a cool wet summer, the chances are it's still going to be a bit hotter and a bit drier than your spring or your autumn. I had planted some agastache and some geranium in spring, and 2 of them were planted in the wrong place. So I moved them and I thought, well, it's better just to get them into the right place. But actually they continually wilted even though I watered them. And I think they're fine now, but I wouldn't have actually moved them in summer otherwise. The one thing I think you should do in late summer, if you're going to have just one gardening job, and that's deadheading. Every morning I come out into the garden with the puppy and a cup of tea, and I snip as many deadheads off the plants as I can. It's actually a pleasure, it's not a chore, but it does mean that you keep the flowers pumping out. Of course, not all plants need deadheading, and I've got a video that I'll put in the description below that talks a bit more about that. But really, if you've got things like dahlias and cosmos, really just keep them going by deadheading, deadheading, deadheading. And this little pot here is another bit of the sedum, or the Hylotelephium, from one that I bought. Hylotelephium is an absolute magnet for snails, and I had bought this plant and the snails went and they chewed off the lovely thick fleshy stalks all round the plant except for one strand. So I picked these stalks off that they had chewed off. I got them when they were still alive, and I put them in a vase and they rooted in water. So I've taken the root, or at least one of them. One did not root, one did root. So this is the plant that was originally a stalk gnawed off by a snail. It was put into water, it developed roots, and then I put it into a pot with some potting compost, and I'm soon going to plant it out, and I'm hoping it'll make another plant. You may have noticed that we have some edging there, and it's a Gothic edging called Gothic wire edging from a company called Agriframes. I bought it, I don't have any relationship with the company. Ozzy, the new puppy, took to using the border as a shortcut across the garden. And actually I'm quite pleased with it. It's just over a foot high, so it should discourage Ozzy, but actually it's holding back some of the plants and acting almost as a plant support. So actually I'm rather pleased with that. Here in the back border, not much has changed over the past few years, and the main flowers are the Japanese anemones. Japanese anemones are very pretty and they're good flowers for late summer. However, if you plant them in your garden and they get well established, they can be invasive and they can be very difficult to get rid of. I have actually dug this bed up twice. Once I dug it up and once it was dug up by a professional gardener. So it's not entirely my incompetence, but on neither occasion were we able to get rid of the Japanese anemones. I think that's why I'm hearing them being called Japanese enemies on Instagram. But actually they are pretty, so I forgive them. This is a variegated golden king, and what variegated means is that the leaves are two-tone, and this is a dark green and a yellow, and I love the variegation, but you may see that a few of the leaves are just a plain yellow. Now I have to cut the branches that have these plain yellow leaves out, because if you allow plain leaves to grow on a variegated bush, what you may find is that the whole bush goes back to plain leaves. That's because it's reverting to some ancient ancestor that wasn't variegated and was plain. So that's a job that I've got to do now. This is the veg patch, and of course this year I haven't grown veg, and so I've accidentally finished up rewilding it, which actually I found rather interesting, because if I look at the different borders I can see that different things have grown in them, and I can probably, if I do a bit of research, find out a bit about what does well when I go back to growing veg again. This area where I'm sitting had become a dumping ground over the years, so I decided it was time to completely clear it and put a table and chairs, because I'd like to make this area with the raised beds, these tables and chairs and the sundial from the parterre, and turn it into a little, almost self-contained garden of its own. I'm not quite certain where would be best to position the sundial. That's an ongoing conversation, but I think these raised beds would be good for either vegetables, possibly as a cutting garden, maybe as a cottage garden, or maybe continue with the rewilding, but it'll give me an area where I can experiment every year. I put together all the videos on revamping a border into a playlist, so if you're interested in revamping a border, that's at the end of this video, and thank you for watching. Goodbye!